Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action on all things related to sustainability. With me, Nigel Lake, here in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco. Today we are going to have what I think will be a really insightful discussion about the world of animal-free food, plant-based food, cultivated meats. There's lots of terminology and we will dig into that in a little bit shortly. For everybody, by the way, who's joining us in Zoom, please do say hello to each other in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you are, if you have any particular interests and any questions. And if you're on YouTube, then please do use the like button. It helps more people to see this and hear the important things that we're going to learn about today. So we are going to be joined by Irina Geri from Change Foods. And I think we're going to dive straight into this and ask Irina to join us now. And there's lots of terminology, Irina. I know there's plant-based and other things. Maybe we should just start with that. What is out there? What should we call it, and maybe why?
Well, let me start by saying that the terminology is still forming. As we are looking to bring more and more new food technologies to market, we are finding ourselves in need of creating distinctive names in order to describe it properly so that people understand what these foods are and what they're not. Plant-based, I think, is fairly well understood by just about everybody globally. It's the foods made with plant ingredients. Now we're looking to introduce couple of new technologies to market that will currently have kind of test drive names that hopefully, we will solidify as we go forward. One you mentioned is cultivated meat. That is, real animal meat grown from cells in bioreactors where no animals are involved, but you get the actual meat product or meat foods. The other one is what we're calling animal-free foods, and that is using a different type of technology where we're able to use microorganisms to produce, in our case, dairy proteins that can then be formulated to create our favorite dairy foods. Change Foods is working on animal-free cheese. It is distinctive in that we are using real dairy proteins, not plant-based. So we're getting the functionality and the nutrition of what you would expect from your beloved dairy foods, also without involving animals in the process. And then there's another category of food which uses a different type of fermentation in the industry called biomass fermentation, such as what products you would know by a brand called Corn that out of the UK, and a number of others coming in the market where they're fermenting microorganisms and using that fermentation broth that tends to come with high quality protein, fiber, and nutrients and vitamins that are also incredibly exciting as far as offering great nutrition at a much lower environmental impact. And again, there's another name that needs to kind of come on board to help consumers learn about these foods. And so the world of food is rapidly changing and the terminology is still flexing, but I would say that the cultivated, animal-free, and plant-based are the pillars that I'm very familiar with that are still changing, I guess, and could still evolve as we go.
Yeah, and in there you mentioned cheese and you mentioned form and function. I know I've tried my own experiments with vegan cheese, and you can try to grate it and it doesn't grate very well, and you can hope that it melts and it dries out and burns. I think this what is coming is the ability to match flavor and form and function with something that's then animal free. Interested in your comments on that.
It's absolutely fascinating. You're absolutely right. Plant-based foods have been around for decades, right? And millennia in case of tofu and soy-based foods. And I would say that the newer generation of plant-based foods, such as all the milks, oat milk, soy milk, almond milk, etc., have come quite a long ways to where in the United States, plant-based milks now have 16% market share of all dairy sales. Other categories such as meat or cheese or ice cream are further back in terms of the product development, and some are specifically held back by functionality. So the pain point you've described, plant-based cheese, does okay as a cold slice, but then if you try to put it on a pizza, it just doesn't work the same way. It doesn't stretch, it doesn't melt, it doesn't have that mouthfeel. And a lot of that functionality comes specifically from a dairy protein. So it's really hard to work around that unless you are able to make or use a real dairy protein. And this is where particularly precision fermentation offers a step change in technology without using animals, right? And so there's an incredible sustainability benefit while giving you the same eating experience as we would say, and being able to enjoy the food you love.
Absolutely, and I know you and I were managed to get together physically face to face in San Jose a few months ago, and we saw the Change Foods, a really early prototype of the product there, which is I'm going to play a video of it now. I mean, for me, just truly amazing because this just looks like a real thing. It's just I was quite blown away by that.
It's
It
pretty
didn't.
exciting.
It tasted pretty well too, and pretty good too. And that was really early on. So I'm going to come back to this thing about environment. But one question I had is, what brought you into this whole arena in the first place? Because you're now working in Change Foods, a startup based in the West Coast. But before that, you've been in some big name businesses, Danone and I think P&G.
Mhm.
What brought you into this whole world of animal-free food or whatever label we want to put on it?
Yeah. For me, the journey really started with health. I think people come into this environment from a multitude of angles, but health is being one of the very common ones. When about 10 years ago, I watched Forks Over Knives and I learned about plant-based foods and the power that it has to really grant us good long-term health. And it really started for me from that direction. But the more you learn about food and the more you learn about the impact of food, very quickly I realized that not only our individual health is greatly impacted by the foods we eat, which we kind of all know, but also the planetary health is greatly impacted by foods we eat. And once I started kind of learning about the connection between the foods we eat, especially the Western style diet that is very heavy and reliant on, meat and dairy and animal products in general, the outsized impact that it carries to the planet, combined with everything we now are learning and hearing. The latest IPCC report just came out yesterday saying that we are at this absolute crisis point where we're marching ourselves into a disaster. And unless we change everything about the way our energy is produced, but also the way we feed ourselves, must be addressed. We can no longer just continue on our merry way, leaving a trail of pollution and emissions behind, assuming we're going to make it, right? So to me, it was, a personal journey, but really combined with kind of seeing the greater crisis evolve around the globe. And I have two kids and, just looking at them and being a
Yeah.
mother and saying, I could not possibly live my life pretending like the music's not going to stop on our watch, because it is stopping on our watch and there is no one else coming to solve this. So for me, it was a very personal mission cry to say, I will not spend another day working on anything other than solving this issue. And so applying my skills, in food marketing and in understanding why do people eat what they eat and how do we drive change in that domain really became a mission and a passion and a purpose. And, I found my way into Change Foods and now I'm, living the dream.
Fantastic. And we're also joined today by Sonali Figueres from Green Queen in Hong Kong, who's with us asynchronously, but I put exactly the same question to her, and you've picked up a little bit on this, which is there are lots of different reasons which can draw people into changing the way that they eat. And so this was her response.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I founded Green Queen, it was really more around the bigger trend of conscious living and an awareness that consumers were pricing in the environment, or were starting to. We're talking about 10 years ago now, right? I also have another business called Eco Warehouse, which involves the food supply chain, organic food to be specific. And so I was traveling regularly to major food shows across the world. And that's really where I came face to face with what at the time I called, future of food, but now is called alternative protein to an extent, and food tech. But essentially, I started meeting companies like the early ones, like Beyond Meat and, New Wave Foods and projects like New Harvest and Eat Just, which was called Hampton Creek at the time. And I realized, or I felt, that these were founders that were moving the dial in a bigger way than maybe the tofu and tempeh and meat alternative brands of yore had been, where they were not just saying we're offering protein that's plant-based. They were saying we're offering meat that is made from plants, which is somehow a fundamental shift in thinking. And so that's when we started chronicling the industry and writing about it. So I think we were one of the earliest media in the world, certainly in Asia, to really notice this trend. And it was because I was attending these food shows internationally and just meeting these founders and going, wait, this.
And now you were talking a bit before about the environmental question. I know for me that was something that really brought me into all of this. And I mean, there's different ways to think about this. One thing that really shocked me, I read this book last year. Some of you may, I suspect many have read *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, and tells a fascinating story about mankind's journey around the world. And incidentally, for those that don't like heavy reading, I accidentally bought the comic novel version of it, or the graphic novel, which was fantastic for an easy read. But one thing it talks about is mankind expanded around the world until about 2000 or so years ago, when all of that and about that time we invented farming. But that was also the time we'd finished eating all the mammals. Because, where we are today, I think not much different even from then. On the planet, 60% of the mammals by body weight is food we're about to eat, animals we're about to eat. 36% is people, and 4% is everything else, including your pets. And those numbers sound crazy, but then you think about, well, what are all the mammals you've seen in the last month? And most of it's people and food, and not very much of it's mammals. So interested in, what are some of the statistics or the things that have really brought this home to you as to why the environment matters so much as part of this whole discussion around food?
The interesting kind of concept to introduce here is how terrible we humans are at big numbers, right? When you tell me 60% of all mammals are foods we eat or animals we eat, it's really hard to comprehend. Right? Or if I tell you we eat as species, there's 8 billion of us or 7 billion of us, we annually slaughter 80 billion animals, right? It's mind-boggling numbers. And I think we as humans have a very hard time really taking that on board and understanding that. And, other numbers that, I look at and think about is, our food systems today that contribute, somewhere between 14 and 32% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Again, it's a huge number. You kind of sense that something is out, wrong there, but it's really hard to understand, what do I do about this? And so I find that this conversation is obviously critical, because if you look at large scale numbers, we farm incredible number of animals for food. That farming takes up the size of North and South America combined in terms of land mass that we dedicate to farming crops to feed the animals, and then grazing the animals and hosting the animals that we eat. So literally we're taking up a third of the earth that we live on for our food supply, which is insane. It leads to deforestation, water pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. But when you're driving around in your car daily or kind of going about your daily business, you absolutely do not see this. And when you buy a burger at a fast food joint, you absolutely don't see the tremendous impact that what we eat has on the planet. And so I find it almost more powerful to bring things down to a micro scale. So for example, we're working on cheese. Why are we focused on cheese? Because dairy comes from animals, cows, one of the most environmentally impactful animal species that we farm. So for example, per pound of cheese, it takes 16 bathtubs of water to produce 1 pound of cheese. So think about people trying to cut down on their showering time. I'm like, gosh, skip a pound of cheese and shower away. Or when we talk about burning coal, and we're concerned about that, but again, the same pound of cheese comes with the same greenhouse gas emission impact as burning 40 pounds of coal. It requires the amount of land that would be equivalent to farming 300 pounds of potatoes. So in the world where we have massive greenhouse gas emissions, where we have famines and starvations and where we have water shortages, that pound of cheese, all of a sudden you can understand that the impact it's having is really rather massive, right? And you can feed so many more people, you can use water in so many better ways. And I think bringing it down is what was helpful for me, at least in my conversations with folks. It just makes it easier to digest.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, the more you dig into this, the more you uncover things which are almost, as you say, almost incomprehensible. So having some of these simple reminders, which is, that the metric equivalent for me, which is the kilo of cheese is 5 tons of water, takes you a long time to drink 5,000 liters of water. So it's just mind-boggling. But then, of course, the consumer element of this is, some consumers care about the environment in that way and then go and act on it. But an awful lot of people don't necessarily have that response. It's more organic, or it's some other trigger. So I'm interested in terms of, what do you see in terms of what's driving consumer uptake of all of these products? Because they're certainly everywhere. My local Lidl's got them. It doesn't seem you can be out in the middle of nowhere and go to a McDonald's and that you can have an oat latte and no one blinks. So what do you think's really driven the uptake?
So I would say there's 2 chapters in animal-free plant-based foods. One was the earlier chapter of plant-based food, where a lot of the earlier adopters came in through the health lens. I would say if you surveyed folks, a few years ago, you would find that the vast majority of people were consuming plant-based food as a way to eat better, be healthier. The secondary reason, it was kind of, environment, but there was very little information or knowledge kind of precipitated even through that early adopter group, where people couldn't really articulate exactly what the issues were and what the impact was. And then the third was, animal cruelty, right? That this highly concentrated animal feeding warehouses inflict on animals was a really massive motivator, but for a smaller subgrouping of people. What we're seeing now, I think, is very interesting, because the climate crisis is really coming into forefront for people. Surveys I see of consumers just a broader population indicate that over 2/3 of consumers in the US care deeply about climate crisis. They are very concerned. You go to younger generation, they're petrified about their future. And combined with that concern, there's almost this feeling of powerlessness and inability to do something about it, right? Because a lot of us don't control government policy. We don't really choose how the energy gets supplied to our home, or how the global transportation sector works. And so we see the problem, we worry, and we feel that we can't do anything about it. The absolutely fascinating thing to me is, once we introduce food into this equation, we are now giving people something they can do about it on a daily basis, 3 times a day. You don't have to go full vegan, but by knowing what the impact is of your food, you just might change somebody's behavior enough times to make a massive difference. And the other thing that is happening in parallel with that motivation and knowledge awareness is the food is getting better. The food is getting massively better. Look at the unlock that Impossible and Beyond provided for plant-based meat. We've had plant-based burgers for a very long time, right? They were bean burgers, soy burgers, etc. They were struggling to break through market penetration, because no matter how hard you try, a bean burger is just not the same as a beef burger. It does not give people the same experience. In comes Impossible and absolutely opens up the meat eater market, what Sonali mentioned, right? We're no longer a plant-based burger, we're meat made of plants. I think now with the way we're making dairy and eggs in case of Clara Foods or every company, now we're going to say, look, here is your food, here's your cheese, here's your ice cream, here's your egg. It just happens to be made more sustainably. And now you don't have to feel that there's a trade-off. And so as soon as these products become available and priced closely to their animal-based counterparts, I see a floodgates opening in terms of consumer demands, given the power that it gives people.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I'm going to throw this to Sonali now for her Eastern Hemisphere perspective.
Absolutely. I think the idea that today you can go into, in my case, 7-Eleven in Hong Kong and see Oatly is absolutely the result of so many different factors. And it's kind of silly to kind of narrow it down to one. There is no doubt that there has been this rise of this conscious consumer, right?
Nigel, I lost the sound on Sonali.
For transparency.
Sorry about that. It should be
these
back.
Confluent factors like the internet making it easier to find out stuff about brands, right? Before, you sort of had to trust what brands put out in advertising or on their labels or in stores, right? I mean, that's all the interaction you had. Maybe then you had a customer service number to call them. But if you wanted to know more about their ingredients or call them out on their ethics, you didn't have avenues like social media. So I think it's really important to give social media the credit. You know, social media really gave customers a voice and a power. But social media also did something else. It made the world more visual. And I don't think that without the videos of seeing how cows are treated and dairy calves are conditioned, I don't think we would have seen such a big rise in companies like Oatly.
Yeah.
I think
and even today, people are still not aware of, the lifetime of a chicken you buy. Typically it'll be 6 or 7 weeks, and it's just, there's lots of statistics which I find shocking. On the planet, 2/3 of the body weight of mammals on the planet is food we're about to eat. Right.
There you go.
30% is humans, and only about another 4 or 5% is everything else, including your pet cat. It's just
right. But so many people don't know, but then so many people do know. There's memes, there's videos, there's those social media squares that you see on Instagram or Facebook, and that's contributed. Of course, the other thing that's contributed, let's face it, is, the rise in extreme weather events and the discussion around the climate crisis, which we now call a crisis or an emergency, not just a change. And so it's sort of everything's getting faster, quicker, more, and it's just harder to ignore. And then of course there's a huge trend in health. And at the end of the day, people are realizing that we're not only are we eating too much meat and it's bad in emissions terms, it's also bad in heart attack terms and in cancer terms. And there's more and more research coming out that a plant-based food diet is just a healthier way to be.
So, Irina, do you want to comment on any of that? Because I think it's always interesting to see these different views.
I 100% agree with Sonali. I think those trends are universal. We're seeing this really traveling the globe, right? And obviously the Western diet is kind of the dominant diet in the Northern Hemisphere. And I'm incorporating the United States and Western Europe in kind of, a big blob, right? And Sonali is absolutely right. There is significant health impacts associated with high animal food products, and there's studies upon studies to prove this. What is interesting now, to weave kind of the Eastern Hemisphere into this conversation, is we have growing economies like China, India, that are coming up and aspiring to adopt a more Western lifestyle. With that comes in this greater desire to consume animal foods because they are associated with the Western lifestyle. It's the sign of, we have arrived, we have enough money now to eat meat whenever we want to. It's aspirational. And with that, you have this, proliferation of obviously restaurants and food choices whose sole business it is to get you hooked on these foods that hit every part of your brain, pleasure centers like McDonald's, etc., that are very addictive, right? They're delicious and addictive. And it's very hard for humans to be rational about their food choices, right? So you have these forces combining. And what we're looking at, again, is this collision force. Is not only do we have Western countries continuing to consume the way they consume, but we have much larger percentages of population coming online now, and the projections are astoundingly scary as far as if we were to transplant this diet to the rest of the world and the Eastern Hemisphere, we would need, multiple more Earths to support this, and obviously we don't. We already are outside of our planetary boundaries today, and we certainly cannot do this. So I think the silver lining to me is what Sonali was referring to. There's a greater awakening happening in Australia, in Asia, everywhere in Western Europe, in Latin America, to the impacts of climate crisis. And so I think it's only a matter of time until those dots really do connect and people really understand how their individual choices can be empowering. The other thing is really important to talk about is food security. That is another lens to this entire discussion, is because we've experienced a pretty globalized world, and obviously now with crisis in Ukraine, we're kind of seeing that splinter, and we're seeing that fraction, and we're seeing the interdependence that we have. And with that, there's a couple of considerations to think through. One is sovereign food security, and how do different nations go about supplying food for their population now and in the future. Looking at China, does China really want to try to develop animal agriculture to the same extent as it is in the US to supply food for their growing population? There's no way to meet any sustainability goals by anybody if China does what US is doing, right? Countries like Singapore or United Arab Emirates are looking at it from a very different angle, where being a small country with small territory, they, again, just do not physically have enough land to raise and pasture and feed this many animals. So I think there's another kind of food security thing to look through, and the objectives that nations are putting forward. In fact, China recently issued kind of a strategic document and indicated that alternative proteins is a strategic priority in order to both balance the nutrition needs of the population, but also sustainability goals. And the third layer to this is honestly,
that announcement, I think, was massively significant in that China does not, as a nation, put things in its plans which it doesn't know how it's going to deliver. It has a pretty good
really
track record of
right?
delivering.
And
so it's massively big deal.
I think it is a massively big deal as well. And, fourth layer to add is, we in this industry believe that we are building the food system of the future, right? That these technologies are going to be fundamentally disruptive in reshaping the food system of the future. That in some years from now, whether it's 5, 10, 15, the meat you eat may not come from animals. The milk you drink may not come from animals, right? The cheese you consume. And if you look at both the transformational, but also the economic growth potential of those industries, we are seeing almost like an arms race situation, almost kind of like a space race of sorts, where different governments are actually making that a strategic imperative and a priority to bring these industries into the markets. And especially it's coming from the Asia Pacific region for all of those reasons. And I think that's tremendously important. Because if you think of how the U.S. kind of lost and seeded the solar panel industry and the semiconductor industry, and how regretful we are about this, I think something very similar is about to happen in food, and how governments behave is going to be incredibly important to enable future economies for those countries.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And the example around solar panels is a great one, where everybody complained about Chinese dumping solar panels. All they did was move their pricing 6 months. You got November's price in May, and otherwise it was the same price curve that had been running since the 1960s. But China had a plan, and they've done amazingly well out of it. And I think one thing that struck me is the way that some of this development has happened so quickly. And when I was chatting with Sonali earlier, she raised this point about some of the countries that have been a bit surprising in how quickly they've dived into this. I was trying to play that segment, but for some reason it hasn't played. So give me one second and I will try it again.
Absolutely. So first of all, obviously I'm based in Hong Kong. We cover APAC specifically
and hopefully
for
this is
the
not the segment
world.
I just
And
played.
I'm surprised at how quickly this has just skyrocketed across the region, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly thought that Australia and New Zealand would lead for longer, and it would take longer for the rest of the region to kind of catch up, and not at all. I mean, there are brands launching in all countries all the time. I mean, in Indonesia, you've got these pioneers, Green Rebel. that have managed to get their products into everything from Domino's to IKEA to Starbucks in that country, right?
Yeah.
Singapore has become the world's all protein city, right? Due to huge amounts of government support and infrastructure. Korea, which is traditionally a very conservative society in terms of food and meat consumption, right? Especially beef, right? They love their beef. I mean, out two years ago, there wasn't much to write about Korea, and now it's one of the most exciting places to be for alternative protein. I mean, there are more than 6 cultivated meat companies that are doing incredible things. They're leading the space. And then plant-based launches are happening every week, a lot by big food, which is interesting, right? These big conglomerates are getting involved. So, I mean, you're seeing a real shift. There's a new kind of plant-based not regulation, but sort of promotion of diets that are plant-based are better for health that's just come out a few weeks ago. So that's a really exciting country. India is going faster than planned for plant-based. There's just a proliferation of new startups in the milk space, in the alternative meat space. You've got these Bollywood stars that are lending their heft and their tens of millions of Instagram followers to these brands, right? So there's a real shift there too. So what you can see is that the world has really flattened out, and what the young people want in New York is the same thing they want in Bombay, and the same thing they want in Jakarta, and that to me is really interesting.
So, Irina, where I was going to go next was I often see you talking about other companies on social media that are involved in this whole plant-based, animal-free, cultivated meat space. And it's always reflect on the fact this is a team sport. There's a massive amount of change required, lots of different companies involved with this. Are there any businesses or products you've seen that you found particularly exciting? What's kind of going on out there? What are the products people should be getting out to try, buy, etc.?
Well, like I said, in plant-based space, it's pretty well developed, right? But there are still gaps in market. And I always look at it from a consumer perspective. I look at where is there kind of a job to be done that's not getting done today, right? You mentioned one, plant-based cheese, quite mediocre experience from a consumer perspective. So there's a massive delta there. When I look at plant-based cheese companies, they're all kind of sitting in the similar technology. There's some differences, but there's really a cap on that technology. So when I look at that space, I think precision fermentation as the technology platform is the most exciting and promising way to solve for the gap, right? So there's companies in that space. When I look at plant-based meat, yes, we have a pretty convincing burger at this point with a multitude of options. Chicken nugget getting there, right? Like getting closer, but we have still a massive gap in terms of full cuts, right? How do we get to a steak or chicken breast equivalent? Seafood is a massive gap. Right now, there's some attempts at plant-based seafood. I think most are suboptimal from what I've tried. Cultivated seafood offers an incredible way to close that gap. So companies like Blue Nalu that are scaling right now, cultivated seafood options, I think are really exciting to watch. You move back to, egg space, right? Eggs are very interesting because not only we consume them as just straight up omelet or whatever egg, but they're also an ingredient in so many different foods. And it's a functional ingredient, meaning, in baking, egg provides a certain chemistry that gets your cookies or your macaroons to rise and take shape. There's an exciting company, Every, in our space that's using precision fermentation technology to create egg proteins to close that gap, right? So that's kind of how I view this is not just kind of how is everybody chasing, because again, I think plant-based burger space is just really crowded. And if you're trying to start a company in plant-based burger, I'd say good luck because it's just 80,000 companies chasing one door. But then there's massive gaps in the market. And so I think there are companies that are highly targeted to those gaps with the right technology that I think, for me, present a really interesting opportunity to kind of continue to build out this plethora of solutions And, we have to look at it across the spectrum of where people eat, right? We don't just buy food at the grocery store. We eat in restaurants. We take food to go. We have snacking occasions and dining occasions, and we have different, dietary preferences, adults versus kids, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways to kind of splice and understand consumer needs. And then I think products that are ultimately most successful are the ones that really understand the need and the job to be done, and then offer a solution for that instead of just chasing the trend.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And there's a great question here from Mark Johnson around the IPCC report, which I know you and I chatted about a little bit earlier on, which is, for the first time, there is some material in there around what can happen on the demand side, including food choices. And I won't repeat the whole question, but the essence of it is there a real opportunity to reduce our footprint here? What are the risks around versions of greenwash? So I know there's technology that sounds good, but then when you peel back a little bit underneath, it's not a 90% reduction in the footprint, it's a 90% reduction in one tiny part of the footprint, and the overall impact is minuscule. How real is that opportunity, and where do we need to have our eyes open in judging whether something being put in front of us is a good choice or is just marketing spin?
Yeah. I spend a lot of time engaging in social media on those types of conversations, because you're absolutely right. Right now, the sustainability space is absolutely riddled in greenwash. The easiest way, I think, for me to kind of tell the greenwash from maybe a genuine technology is if you're looking at incumbent player promoting incumbent technology, whether it's fossil fuels saying now we have a natural gas, right? Sorry, that's methane. Or you have, a dairy industry pushing, FDA just approved a low carbon beef. You look at that low carbon beef, the requisite, it's carbon emissions reduction by 10%. Beef blows any food out of the water on carbon emissions. So reducing it 10% is absolutely meaningless. But yet if it's positioned, so it's the same thing by incumbent industry, positioned as a solution to climate crisis, that, is you need to start digging. You need to start looking and understanding. Now, the good and analytical way to look at these impacts, especially food, is what we call a full life cycle analysis, right? When a dairy operation says we're going to reduce our emissions, to zero by 2050, my question is, why are you getting out of the cow business, right? Or are you just talking about emissions on at a plant, right, where not where the most emissions are happening, but just at a small fraction of the production supply chain? So asking those questions and understanding, is there a plan behind the goal? Is there accountability? Does it cover the full supply chain, or is it just, puffery? Is really critical. And we are awash right now in greenwashing, and it's really hard for consumers to really discern and tell what's going on. And I think, to me, if you have any ability as a consumer or as a policymaker to truly shift and the shift needs to happen across energy, transportation, and food sectors. Those are the big three kahunas we got to tackle. We have to shift fundamentally to a different technology, right? We got to move away from fossil fuels to renewables. We got to move from animal-based food systems to non-animal-based food systems. We got to shift our transportation from individually shuffling people in really heavy vehicles fueled by fossil fuels into something very different. That's what we have to do. Short of that, I think it's really just face covers.
Yeah, look, I agree. And for anyone who's not following an arena on Twitter, on LinkedIn particularly, the link is on the website for this show, so you can find her there, and I'm sure you'll find her very easily just by searching. But there is lots of good information out there if you want it. I know the first job I ever had was at the Environmental Research Lab at in Tucson, Arizona, a very long time ago. And there I learned just how much grain it takes to produce a kilo of beef. And it's something in the order of 20 to 24 tons of grain required to produce a kilo of beef. And, the right kind of fish can be as little as, approaching, we were below 2-to-1 on some of the work we were doing then. Chickens might be 4-to-1 or something like that. So even these choices about eating, reduce the amount of red meat you eat, particularly beef, the whole notion of a flexitarian diet, because I think a lot of people don't want to become vegan or become vegan overnight, but taking different choices where you just start cutting back on the things you probably should cut back on is a really good start.
Nigel, a question in the question box for Mark.
Yes, we just did that one on the IPCC report. We've just had a go at that question. I'm not sure how much more we can do in it. And any companies that, well, where to next, I suppose. What other issues have you been thinking about, Irina, beyond the things we've covered? I've got a few more questions here, but is there anything else you think we should touch on? I know the IPs, all of this is so urgent. There are lots of choices out there.
I mean, to me, honestly, it's about moving the system, right? A lot of the times people like to talk about individual choices and individual decisions, right? And yes, it's important. And yes, we all could make a difference, especially when it comes to food choices. But when we talk about energy systems and transportation systems, individual choices become a lot more harder, right? They become harder because I don't choose how my house is powered or the electricity that comes to my house, right? I'm not going to, quarantine myself forever and never travel on an airplane again because of the emissions, right? Those choices are untenable for most folks. And I think we really owe it to ourselves to shift to systems approach. And what, the analysis is there, right? The IPCC has put out all these solutions. Most of them require concerted global effort at countries or systems levels, right? Transitioning away from fossil fuels, transitioning away from industrialized animal agriculture, transitioning the transportation sector. A lot of that work has to happen at policy level. And I think, we as individuals do need to put pressure on politicians and hold them accountable to the promises they make, whether it's Paris Accord or others, and demand plans. It's not just enough to say, oh, we're going to go zero emissions or carbon negative by 2050. We owe it to ask, well, how are you going to do this? What are the steps? When will you take those steps? Who is going to be accountable? And what are the punitive measures that are put in place if you don't reach those steps? Because what I find is that the greater jeopardy we're in is everybody now is shifted away from denying climate change. I think we're very much past that as a society. But now we've entered the age of, zero by 2050, and I won't be in this job, so not my problem. I think is the jeopardy there. And so demanding accountability to short-term goals and metrics is something we, as consumers and members of society, absolutely must do. Otherwise, the little changes we make individually are just not enough.
Yeah, I think this is a theme that's come up for us a lot in a variety of different places, which is the need to recognize that we've failed at much of this for 50 odd years since the UN Environment Programme was created 50 years ago, the original Stockholm Conference in 1972. I'm not sure that celebration is the right word for what will happen in Stockholm this year to mark 50 years. And one of the reasons we've failed is that time and again we've looked for a single solution to the problem. And today people still ask me, well, what's the one thing I can do? Whereas the essence of the problem is it is an entirely systemic problem, and we need to recognize that. We need systemic solutions, and we somehow need to make those accessible to people. And one project I've been involved with, and I'll put a link in the chat, is the Earth for All initiative, which has been run under the umbrella of the Club of Rome. And what that is bringing forward really is a solution to this problem of single point solutions to problems not working, which is to say, here is a way of understanding how the entire physical world and economic system and society fits together. Here is tools which will allow you to project accurately what is likely to happen over the next several decades, and to be able to see, perhaps most importantly, that some of the actions that are recommended, if done in the right way, actually make everything better for everyone. and hopefully provides a catalyst for there to be more activity. So watch this space on that one. The outputs from that work will start to emerge in the next few months. The other thing that I look at in my dark moments when I'm thinking, we've been at this for 50 years, we have singularly failed, and what can we do to somehow, have confidence that we're going in the right direction? One great thing for me was the Super Bowl this year, and I'm not a fan of American football particularly, but there were 9 ads for cars in the world's biggest advertising spend event of the year, and 7 of them were for electric vehicles.
Yes.
And so what I now do on social media is every time I'm shown an ad by a company for a vehicle that's not electric, I just block that account and I'm never going to hear from them again. So there is some of this change happening, which I think is really positive. I asked Sonali about the exciting companies that she's seen, and I'm just going to share what she said.
It's really hard to pick winners, but one limitation for me is that I've been in Hong Kong, so I haven't been able to travel and try everything. But I have to say, Green Rebel in Indonesia sent me a box of all their products, and I had, vegan rendang, vegan satay, and it was outstanding. I was really impressed. They were one of the first in Asia to do vegan steak, a whole cut steak. And it was really, really delicious. So I find them very exciting for a couple of reasons. Well, they're in Indonesia. Their pricing is very interesting. They work with local ingredients. So they have things like turmeric and galangal and coconut that are local to their market. Yeah. Which I think is quite interesting. They have very short ingredient labels, right?
Yeah, which I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a big trend globally, right? As there's this, as the two kind of plant-based and health conflates. Look, I don't think every product should meet every single demand, right? Like at the end of the day, if you can eat organic kale salads with organic chickpeas every day and cook it at home, good for you. Mm-hmm. I think some products are there to help people transition. Some products are there because they're at a better price. So, not every product has to take every single box, right? And usually if you take the best nutrition box, it's going to be at a higher price and it's going to be maybe less accessible. So sometimes there's a kind of accessibility for price compromise, which I think is okay, because at the end of the day, from an emissions point of view, all of these things are better than industrially reared meat.
And I think, again, for me, it's there's just so much happening. It's quite exciting. Is there anything you wanted to pick up on in there, Irina?
I want to pick up on the money trend a little bit. So kind of starting where Sonali started talking about, and where you started talking about, yes, there's exciting startups and exciting business opportunities, right? And right now, the sector of alternative protein is attracting quite incredible sums of money from venture capital. There's a number of, analysis showing, billions of dollars flowing into plant-based and animal-free food businesses. On the other end, I think, if greed and kind of money is what got us into the mess, and I'm including fossil fuel industry into the equation here, I think leveraging money and finance as a way to really shift the system is probably the most important lever that we have today. Right now, we are putting a lot more money in billions of dollars or trillions of dollars into fossil fuel subsidies than we spend on anything that's health or planet promoting as a society. Right now, we are not pricing at all any negative externalities produced by either the fossil fuel industry or industrial animal agriculture, right? They're not treating the waste. They're not accountable for water pollution, air pollution, animal suffering, human suffering that's caused by these systems. It's not priced into the product. So the market.
Yeah, and just to put the number in context, is something like $5 to $6 trillion US a year is the total subsidy to the fossil fuel industry, including all the unpriced damage. And that is world GDP is 80 trillion. So it's a really massive number, right? 6 or 7% of world GDP.
If you want to drive change, yes, it's exciting and it's important to invest in these newer companies that are changing things either on the energy side or transportation side or food side. But I think the bigger levers are the capitalist system levers, right? There's talk of starting to put, climate risk into some of the investments, right? To associate, climate impact with some of those industries. Because the minute you really truly start pricing in either the risk or the downsides into some of these industries, they become financially unattractive.
Yeah.
Right. Putting money into a new coal mine or into a new dairy operation now comes with a massive risk of having a stranded asset. And once we move the capital markets away from that and towards the renewables or more sustainable food, I actually think we'll have more of an impact than we would by trying to shift consumer sentiment. So I'm in the camp of doing both always, right? Personal and societal responsibility. But if I'm looking at the business community and the investment community, I really want to see a lot more push to divest from businesses and industries that are damaging to the environment and to really start pricing in the costs and the risks associated with them, because I think that will just fundamentally reshape the global economy.
Yeah, and there's a really good question here on the side around, and this comes back to the thing we're always keen on, which is what can people do? And one of the questions is, for foundations, so philanthropic organizations, what can they do? Of course, one thing they can do is think about how they invest if they're running an investment portfolio. But the other, one other which comes to mind for me is one of the challenges with some of the adaptation that's required in relation to the agricultural food chain is very easy for people to get left out and left behind by that. So if you're trying to act on this, then can you find ways to invest, to support inclusive development as these new technologies emerge, so that we don't leave behind small farmers or other communities? Interested in if you've got any comments on that about, where are the people that get left out of this transition if they're not supported?
I think it's critical, right? Think of the coal transition, how challenging it has been, predominantly driven by the fact that there's a group of people, coal miners, whose lives and livelihoods have been affected by this. I think it's important to take them into account, both from a fairness perspective, but also from transition perspective. The other industry to look at is, we're all upset about Amazon deforestation, right? We're hearing the data, we are appalled, we want to, criticize the government and criticize the people, but ultimately, if you look at the reasons why is this happening, right, is because people who are in charge of keeping that land are making money by deforesting it, right? That is their life and livelihood. They're not doing it for fun. They're doing it as a way of sustaining their families. Let's offer them a different way to sustain their families. Where is a company that's allowing me to buy an acre of land on Amazon? I just want to buy it, put it in preservation, and I will pay somebody to sustain their life and livelihood for, whether it's carbon credits, whether it's some other way of accounting for it and crediting them for the greater good that this is creating. Again, we're going back to kind of the externalities not being part of our financial system, but the profits are. Let's flip that on its head. Let's start paying people that are on the ground for transitioning either out of deforestation or out of fossil fuel industry or out of coal mining, et cetera, giving them lives and livelihoods, and in the interim, purely just compensating them for the change that's happening, I think is absolutely critical. So I actually am looking actively to see what businesses, what schemes could come out to really truly help us, because we could scream all we want about deforestation. We will change it much faster if all of a sudden we have a crowdfunding campaign that allows us to buy swaths of Amazon.
Absolutely. And I know we had on the show about it earlier on, people from the Pachamama Alliance in the Amazon region, where they are doing exactly this. And for me, it's the kind of Steve Irwin solution. One of the wonderful things Steve Irwin did, having made a lot of money out of his nature shows, was just buy up habitat in a really strategic way, as has been continued by his family ever since, which is pretty fantastic. And one other question that came up in the Q&A, and I know we're rapidly heading towards the top of the hour here, is a particular one about, the challenge with some of the animal-free products is the chemicals that are being used to make the meat product taste like meat. And I think for me, part of the answer to that is the cellular processes which are coming through now, or which are delivering a much more realistic or completely realistic product, will be the answer to that. We're getting towards more natural, effectively more natural products. Is that right?
I think some of the concern is real, right? Like if you look at plant-based meats today, they do have long lists of ingredients. Some are just misunderstood. Others, maybe are not ideal, right? They're not whole plant foods. But some of it, I think, is largely misplaced. For example, the heme in Impossible Burger. It sounds like some sort of voodoo scary thing, right? But what it is it's heme, which you would get in a meat, right? It's a protein. It's just instead of producing it from an animal, now we've produced it through fermentation, through precision fermentation. It is no better or worse than the heme you would get from a burger, right? Again, I'm not going to sit here and insist that heme is a wonderful thing you should eat all the time, but I will tell you that it's probably no worse. And if you are going to eat a burger, you might as well eat this other burger because you're doing it for a different reason. As Sonali said, it's not kale salad. It's doing a very different job, but I don't know that it's any more risky or unnatural, right? Same thing, we look at, precision fermentation technology has been in our food forever. A good example I like to give is cheese. When people start to worry about, oh my gosh, you're going to make dairy proteins, in this new way, and is it safe to eat? I will tell you, 90% of cheese today worldwide is made with non-animal rennet. Rennet is an enzyme that used to come from from stomachs of calves, right? We 30 years ago figured out a way to produce that through precision fermentation. It's the same exact enzyme, it's just produced in a different way. It's been in our food safely and deliciously, and nobody's even noticed. And now all we're doing is we're producing now a dairy protein in the exact same way. So I think a lot of this concern and kind of the fear of the unknown is largely unwarranted. And I see that people, after they kind of get to know this a little bit and maybe experience it and see that, there's not some sort of a massive scandal behind it, I think we will get over it. It's a transition. Like people were freaked out about cell phones. Remember the whole brain cancer thing? And we've kind of moved on, right? When we started transition the ice from the lakes to artificial ice or freezer ice, there was a lot of freak out over, the healthfulness of the naturalness of that ice. So some of that comes with just change. And I think we just need to be patient a little bit and be thoughtful and be clear about what it is to ease some of those concerns. But ultimately, honestly, I don't see this as a massive hurdle long term.
And to wrap up, in 60 seconds or less, what's one thing you'd love people watching this to go away afterwards and do?
I would love for people, everybody's has some impact in the world around them, whether it's in the professional life that they have or in personal life. And what I would love for somebody to go do is pick one thing that you will go and you will change tomorrow or today. Be it your personal food commitment, don't have to go vegan, but like maybe it's once a week you eat vegan, right? Maybe it's I'm going to switch my vehicle, right? Or I'm going to put solar on my panel. Or maybe it's I'm going to call all my representatives and talk to them about climate. Or maybe it is I'm going to switch jobs and I will get out of one of those nasty industries and I will go dedicate my resources and talent to something. So pick a thing that is meaningful, real, and impactful that you can do and go do it. I don't care what it is. If we all do it, it's going to make a difference.
Fantastic. And I'm going to give the last word here to Sonali before bringing Paul in to take us into what episodes we've got coming up. Excuse me 1 second. Let me try that again.
Go and do, I would say, why not try, right? But I would add on to that, when you try, keep an open mind, because what I often find is that every single plant-based meat brand or dairy brand is painted with the same brush for people that are not, accustomed to them. And the reality is today, we literally have 1,000 companies worldwide in this industry, and they're all doing incredibly different things with different ingredients, different production processes, different taste profiles, different nutrition labels. So give the industry a chance, to prove your preconceptions wrong sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Impossible is there, but we've also got Green Rebel in Indonesia. We've got, Omni Seafood from Green Monday here in Hong Kong that's delicious. I mean, there's all different kinds.
Yeah.
And I think we often just go, oh, it's all, it's all processed and it's all bad. No, it's all founders trying to say, hey, how can we decarbonize our plate? Because we have a climate emergency, and hey, guess what? Industrial animal agriculture is a huge culprit in our carbon budget. So can we have a more open mind?
Well, Irina, thank you so much. I think if we can channel even 10% of the positive energy and ideas that you and Sonali have brought and shared with us today, I think we will be in very good shape. So thank you sincerely. And Paul, over to you to take us through what's coming up.
Sure. Well, I'm so inspired today. So thanks everyone for joining us in the audience. And thank you, Irina, for joining us live, and Nigel in New York, and Nick Gower, our producer. So coming up next time on ESGX, we have the bioeconomy boom. There's a tech stack. There's also an agriculture stack, the ag stack for the 21st century. So we're going to go do a deeper dive on what that means and how to go from farm to table, or how to bring food through the whole system. And then following that, we'll have Intel, just like there's Intel inside your computer, Intel inside Ohio. So one of the largest fabrication facilities for making semiconductors is coming to Ohio, into the center of Ohio, around Columbus and the like. So Dr. Fadel Kaboub and some special guest speakers, soon to be confirmed. We'll have a deep dive discussion on that. And then our regular monthly Green Jobs Report, led by Amir Khalegi of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And remember, this is the week of the month of Earth Week, Earth Day, and sort of climate action for the whole month, which we need to make the whole year. So please tune in on ESGX for those. And Nigel, I think we want to celebrate 2 years of ESGX, right?
Fantastic. Yes, we will leave you with our celebratory video to mark 2 years since we first had our ESGX baby, and a very sincere thank you to everybody who's joined us along the way, and here's to all that lies ahead.